So, Steve, you've been a part of picking a DCCC chair and the executive director. I believe, if I have this right, in 1999, you picked a young up-and-comer named David Plouffe to run the DCCC. So we hear a lot from our listeners about the DNC, the DCCC, the DSCC chair. These will be the first kind of forks in the road for how the caucuses are thinking about the future. How should they approach this here, and how will they approach this?
Well, I think as a party, and we've been in this position before, we don't control anything. So it is a challenge. There's no titular head of the Democratic Party. Barack Obama does not want to be the titular head of the Democratic Party. Bill Clinton doesn't want to be. And Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer have individual caucuses that they are responsible for, and they have a lot to do. They have to oppose Donald Trump on some issues. They are busy, and their job is to win in 2026. There's a bunch of governors who are both up in 2026 and who are thinking of running for president in 2028. So there's really nobody who gets up every morning and thinks about the entire party. And there's no titular head. There are people who I could recommend should be the titular. I think Rahm Emanuel could run the Democratic National Committee, or there's many other people like that who could do that. But at the moment, the people in the House and Senate are going to be focused on how do I win the majority back in 26. And my advice to them is pretty simple, which is you need to focus on the fundamentals, and you need to focus on having people run your party committees who know how to run campaigns, and frankly, who have an open mind about what just happened, and who have the ability to say, we need to change everything. Like, we didn't win, and we shouldn't assume that doing the same thing over again, that we're going to win in 2 years. And I think they need to think about not just what did we do wrong, but they need to talk to the people who won. I mean, there are some, both in the House and the Senate, there are some real interesting cases that I don't know enough about. I'd like to know how, in this world in which we're all, freaked out about cultural issues, how did a member of the LGBT community in Wisconsin outrun Kamala Harris? How did Tammy Baldwin get elected to the Senate in a swing state with a lot of money spent against her? How did Alyssa Slotkin get elected in Michigan in a swing state with a lot of money spent against her? How did Jared Golden in Maine win in a Trump district? I think there's a bunch of people who won in either swing states or Trump districts that we need to go dig into their campaign and find out the positive case about what did they do that made them run ahead of the ticket? What issues did they talk about? How did they position themselves, both in terms of how did they communicate? What kind of tools did they use? I think there's a lot to learn from that. I know there is an incentive to do a hot take with what's going on now. Everyone wants to know what happened. Like, what's the answer now? And I think we also have to take a deep breath and take not forever, but take a little time and both learn our lessons from what we did wrong, but also look at what we did right and how that could help us win in 26.
Steve, how would you do the autopsy in Wisconsin?
I think I think we need, it's a whole combination of looking at all the paid and unpaid media, looking at the data, looking at where the votes came from. I think we make again, we need to sort of throw everything out and think differently. I'd say when you did this, 12 years ago or 10 years ago, it would be, well, let's just look at what the TV commercials said. But clearly, the way in which people are getting information is vastly different. Let's look at, clearly the data, the way in, not just polling, but the way in which campaigns process and slice and dice data needs to be looked at. I mean, I don't believe when people told me that the Harris campaign was going to win, I don't think they were lying to me. I think they were relying on bad data or bad models. And we need to dig into that and find out why.
When you think about the presidential, there's some who say that it was not a winnable race because of inflation and wrong track. Do you believe that Vice President Harris, if she and her campaign had operated differently, it was a winnable race?
I think it's frankly, I think on the presidential level, the victory, while it wasn't a landslide, and we need to disabuse people of that notion, it was still close, but he did win all of the swing states. And I don't think it was a question of tactics, frankly. I think it was much more about the bigger issues. It was much more about running uphill against a unpopular president, the economy, immigration, the cultural issues. And then I think there were four things: the economy, immigration, the cultural issues, and then the way in which we communicate, which I know you've talked about a lot. I just think, and I'm as guilty of this as anyone, I live in a particular, East Coast media ecosystem, and I read all that, and I forget that most of the country does not. And most of the country has a lot less information. They're not stupid. They just have less info. They don't follow this as closely. They're busy. This is not what they do for a living. They're doing other things. And I think we need to really, really look hard as a party, because clearly the Trump people did, as how are we communicating with people? And it's not just like do less TV or do more digital or whatever. It's this whole ecosystem. We really need to dig in deep and figure that out. So
Yeah. Dan, 1 second. One of the most interesting figures in the party now to me is John Fetterman, who's proven to be kind of surprising as a communicator, as kind of being willing to criticize the party. Here's his tweet on Matt Gaetz, because I raised the question of whether he might show deference to the president. John Fetterman, there have been serious qualified individuals nominated to posts, like Rubio or Stefanik. Eric Schmidt would make a solid choice for AG. But Dem opinions on Gaetz aren't that interesting. The good ones will come from my GOP colleagues to justify a vote for that jerk off. Dan.
Speaking in English, yes. Steve, you helped Congressman Gephardt in the early 2000s, kind of after Bush had gotten elected, and he was thinking about 2004. We get asked frequently about candidates, who might run in 28. How do candidates use these next few years? You're going to have the midterms, as you say, some of these governors are going to be up. How do people think about and use wisely these next few years to get ready?
I think that has changed a lot. I think you used to use these 2 years. You would spend a lot of time studying the rules and the map and where's Iowa and where's New Hampshire and how could I potentially impact any of that. And then you would spend a lot of time learning about the issues, and you would spend a lot of time meeting people who could, bundle money for you, raise you 100,000, raise you 200,000, raise you 500,000. I think the campaign has changed drastically from that. I think the map is less important because I think it's going to be much more about your larger narrative and your larger communications plan and less about state by state to begin with. I mean, either you're going to get in the game and have a compelling narrative and a compelling message, or you're not, in my view. It's not going to be this micro, like I'm going to go to Iowa and like Dick Gephardt did, or others have, and spend 2 years and slingshot out of there. I think you have to have a much bigger communication strategy and narrative before you get there. And I think the money, and I think we got to unpack all this, but the money has become vastly different. I think, in my view, unfortunately, there are virtually no rules anymore. And I think finding, 1,000 people to, times 100 people to raise you $1 million is just not what we're doing anymore. It's much more the super PACs. It's much more these people who are going to spend $50 million or $100 million to elect you president. And that's a different game than going around and meeting people who could bundle $100,000 for you. So I think you're going to spend, to me, what you really need to do, and almost everybody who's going to be a serious contender, no offense to my friends in the Congress, is going to be a governor. It's going to be somebody from outside of Washington. And what I would do if I was that governor is, one, be successful in your state and have a record to run on of you got, as our friend Josh Shapiro says, you got shit done. Many of them are saying that. And then figure out this larger narrative about who am I and how am I going to communicate with voters in a different way than we did in the last election.